Hey, all right, it's the country. This is episode 19, originally recorded on September 18th, 2023. And we got a lot to talk about. As always, please visit us at thecountry.news. Give us a subscription. Check us out. We really appreciate it. Well, today on The Country, 25% of the economy is morbidly obese. We reflect on the anniversary of 9/11 last week. But we begin today with Speaker McCarthy and his decision, his proposal on a new plan to avoid a government shutdown that includes an 8% spending cut for domestic agencies and a resumption of the border wall construction. According to Bloomberg, the House GOP factions agreed to this plan and offer these proposals in exchange for a 31-day temporary funding. So a little bit of red meat for the Freedom Caucus and a mild, very soft proposal for the Democrats. The bill would also not include funding for the war in Ukraine, which is something they want, the Democrats, and disaster relief for victims of the Maui wildfires. At first glance, these are good proposals that are on the way to solving our major deficit crisis. The national debt is spiraling out of control. Despite President Biden's claims that he has cut the deficit, he really had a $1.3 trillion deficit, which is the second largest in history. He did cut it from the previous year, but that was the pandemic year where it was ridiculous, like $3 or $4 trillion. And despite those claims that he's cutting the deficit, the projections are that that deficit will be $2 trillion at the end of this fiscal year, at the end of this month. And that's almost double, again, the previous year and the second highest on record. Indeed, our annual deficit has taken a huge dip in the past few years, and it's entirely unsustainable. So at first glance, Speaker McCarthy's proposals seem like a good start. The federal government spent $6.2 trillion in last fiscal year 2022, meaning that an 8% cut in spending would be approximately $500 billion in cuts to next year's budget. That's fiscal year 2024. This would be a good start in moving forward towards a balanced budget. However, there's still a huge gap. So if fiscal year 2023 is $2 trillion in deficit and McCarthy cuts the entire thing by 8%, it's still only $500 billion, or still $1.5 trillion in deficit spending, assuming there's no other changes. But wait a minute. The Speaker's plan only calls for cuts to domestic agencies. It's unclear exactly what he means, but in Washington speak, we can assume this means no cuts to defense and no cuts to mandatory spending, things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, etc. Quick sidebar, it's not mandatory. Those spendings were passed by law. They can be passed in other ways to affect different cuts or different levels of spending by law. So they're not mandatory necessarily. They're just mandatory when you do nothing like our Congress does. Okay? Now, look, when you talk about cuts to Medicare, Social Security, people get afraid. Why don't we just cut Medicare for people who are worth more than $100 million? Okay, so anyway, back to the story. The sad truth is that this sort of domestic agencies is just a small slice of the budget. Domestic spending that is non-mandatory is a paltry $910 billion, according to the CBO. That means that the headline that sounds like Congress is getting serious about fiscal responsibility is just that, a headline, a gimmick. It's clickbait. The actual cut of 8% to $910 billion, the domestic agency spending, or my approximation of it, would total a paltry $72 billion cut. To give you an idea of how little that is, the Office of Personnel Management, which is the federal government's, basically their HR department, their budget is $130 billion, or close to double what this proposed cut is. Now, forgive me, I've worked in corporate America a long time. I'm pretty sure we can cut about 98% of any HR budget, but that's a story for another day. Moving on, these deficits, they're not remotely sustainable, not even close. First, they directly cause increases to prices for every good or service every American buys, due to the fact that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury must print money out of thin air to finance these huge deficits. Healthcare costs, despite the promises of Obamacare, have skyrocketed. The war on terror costs us $21 trillion. The cost of college is growing exponentially. You can check all those stories out in thecountry.news, and we're going to talk about a couple of them here in a moment. But here's how this plays out. According to economist John Coltrane at the Stanford University Hoover Institute, he's quoted in the Wall Street Journal. Starting in March 2020, the Treasury issued $3 trillion of new debt, which the Fed quickly bought in return for $3 trillion in new reserves. The Treasury then sent checks to people and businesses, later borrowing about another $2 trillion and spending more checks. Overall, federal deficit rose nearly 30%. And he says, quote, "Is it all a surprise," Mr. Cochran asks, "that a year later that inflation breaks out? Are we really surprised?" He likens this $5 trillion in checks to a classic parable by Milton Friedman, the great monetarist at the University of Chicago who passed away in 2006. He says, "Let us suppose now that one day a helicopter flies over this community and drops an additional 1,000 bills from the sky," which is, of course, hastily collected by members of the community. Now, Friedman was writing in the 60s, so think of it as $100,000 just dropped into your neighborhood. Okay? If they spent the money, inflation would result, right? Everybody would have more money. They want the same goods and services, and supply and demand says they would raise the amount they're willing to pay for things in competition with others who have extra money as well. And so the COVID checks, Mr. Cochran says, were an immense fiscal helicopter drop, a huge fiscal helicopter drop. People are spending the money, driving prices up. Second, each year we finance deficit spending through this method, which is issuing debt and printing money. The interest costs rise. In fact, because of our profligate spending in Congress and the Fed's mismanagement of interest rates over the same period, the U.S. is paying record amounts of interest to service that debt, up 30% year over year from $150 billion in calendar Q4 2021, so the fourth quarter of 2021, to $213 billion in the same quarter last year. Indeed, these levels of debt payments threaten to crowd out all other spending over time and will exceed our massive defense budget soon if it hasn't already. Third, the inflationary regime currently employed by the Treasury and the Fed means that everything you own and everything you've saved is worth less. As the Friedman example indicates, if everyone has more money, tangible goods like homes, your savings, other stocks, assets, real estate, whatever, they lose value comparatively because there's just ever increasing amounts of money in the system and you have the same exact assets. Okay? Perhaps worst of all, this is especially true of working class wages, which never keep up with inflation since the U.S. abandoned the gold standard in 1971, which enabled the current shell game of deficit spending and printing money. So we've got a post up on this on thecountry.news, and you'll see a beautiful chart, and it shows the difference in productivity and hourly compensation since 1948. And up until 1971, when we went off the gold standard, which enabled the Fed to do what we're talking about, increase debt and print money. Up until that point in 1971, productivity of workers and wages, their lockstep is basically the same line. And as soon as we go off the gold standard, wages go here, they raise 15% up to 2017, go up 15% basically, and productivity goes up 246%. So wages stagnated because in part of the going off the gold standard and these constant increases in the money supply that we're talking about that's being affected by the Federal Reserve. Okay, so all of this deficit spending and debt is a serious bad deal for the American people and the country. Speaker McCarthy has the right sentiment, but we need bolder action, sir. We need to secure our future for our children and our grandchildren. So, what should we do? Let us stop making short-term decisions that destroy our wages and our wealth in the long term. Let us hold our leaders accountable. Let us hold their benefactors accountable. And by that, I mean government contractors, government employees, the political class in Washington, and all of those crony capitalists that get sweetheart deals because they're paying off the politicians. We need to hold all of those people accountable for this folly. They'll tell you it's not the right time to reform. You'll destroy the economy. They'll have all these reasons why it won't work. They said the same thing about Brexit. No problems. They said the same thing about, moving the Israeli embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. No problems. They tell you these things because it's never the right time for them, because they profit handsomely from the status quo. I'm making money hand over fist, man. Don't ruin my game. That's really what they're saying to you. These, of course, are man-made problems. We made these problems, and we could just as easily solve them. In fact, 33 states out of 50 have strong balanced budget requirements, according to the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. Okay? So let us shut down the government. That's the bold proposal. In fact, I'll channel Reagan and say, shut down this government, Mr. Speaker, until a balanced budget amendment is passed through Congress. You think that's hard? I don't. I bet you they could solve it in a day. It's time to pay the piper before the piper forecloses on our future. Moving on. 25% of our economy is morbidly obese. Indeed, healthcare costs in America continue to rise with little discussion. While the cable news networks endlessly debate Trump's behavior on January 6th, the Biden family's corruption, UFOs, and climate change, healthcare costs have continued to rise, with insurance plan premiums, what you pay each month for your insurance, alone now 24% of median family incomes, up from 11% in 1999. So, it's insane, more than double. And according to The Balance, in 2020, the total cost of healthcare per person was $12,530, up from just $150 per person in 1960 in inflation-adjusted numbers. That sounds incredible, but it's true. It's an astonishing 820% increase. And while the Biden administration is touting that their Inflation Reduction Act measures that will allegedly cut drug prices for a very small list of drugs, I think it's just 10 that they're starting with, the pharmaceutical industry is by far the biggest lobby in Washington, spending $373 million in lobbying efforts. You can understand lobbying efforts as paying off politicians. And that was in 2022 alone, $373 million. That was $150 million more than any other lobby interest. So it's no wonder that prescription drugs are soaring again in 2023. Pharma's close cousin in the race to make healthcare unaffordable for most Americans, the insurance industry, is third in lobbying money spent. So they're not quite as great at it as pharmaceutical companies, but they're trying. A major concern is that the pharmaceutical industry's marketing campaigns are anathema to real health care. Estimates are that Big Pharma is now the second largest advertiser in America. And a recent study showed that 70% of drugs advertised on TV are of low therapeutic value. You can get the links to this all on thecountry.news. Just look up 25% of the economy is morbidly obese. The concept of disease mongering, where pharmaceutical marketing teams and their advertising partners invent, promote, or otherwise exaggerate new diseases in order to convince unsuspecting Americans to seek treatment, has been identified and studied since the 1990s. And it's working. Prescription drug expenditures rose sharply after the U.S. government began to allow TV advertising for prescription drugs in 1985. For more recent examples, there are a number of serious reports that the FDA did not provide due diligence of the new COVID vaccines. This includes 2 top FDA officials resigned in protest over the Biden administration's booster policy, a Pfizer executive admitting that they never tested the vaccine would stop transmission, and the FDA refusing to provide better information over the risks associated with the vaccine. In 2010, President Obama and the Democrats in Congress passed the Affordable Care Act, colloquially known as Obamacare. The act passed with many spurious promises, including, quote, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, and, quote, if you like your insurance plan, you can keep your insurance plan. None of that was true. And more importantly, the promise that Obamacare would cut the cost of healthcare in America also never came to fruition. Why is this so? From our perspective at the country, real reform of the bloated, inefficient, and costly U.S. healthcare system is captured by classic fascism. The collusion of our elected officials and large corporations, in this case pharma and health insurance, to enrich each other. Insurance companies spent large sums of money to lobby lawmakers, as Obamacare was written, and have become close allies of many politicians as the law and its associated regulations have been implemented. These insurers have since become huge fans of Obamacare as their pockets are lined with government-mandated insurance plans with higher revenues each and every year. There's really it seems, no price control at all. What have we gotten for all of these increased expenditures? One measure of overall health is life expectancy at birth, which did not change in the 8 years after Obamacare was enacted. In 2010, the expected life expectancy at birth of a human was 78.7 here in America, and in 2018, 78.7. It has also been reported that life expectancy since then has decreased for the first time ever in America. And while the number of uninsured Americans dropped significantly from 2010 to 2016, the number of uninsured Americans started rising again soon after, with 30 million uninsured by 2020. The worst part of all these terrible indicators is that no presidential candidate is talking about them. We've seen costs continue to rise unabated, outcomes stagnant, and the people struggling to pay all of these bloated costs. We need real reform to our healthcare system, and it hasn't been seriously considered for more than a decade. We don't have all of the answers here at the country, but we encourage you to ask your elected officials, what's your plan to reduce the total costs of healthcare in America? Seriously, I want to know. Second, in 1999, insurance premiums were 11% of median income. Today, they're 25%. How will you reduce premiums back to 1999 levels? 11%, sir and madam. Are pharmaceutical ads on TV and the internet good for the people? How will you eliminate the bad science and bad outcomes these companies are promoting with little or no oversight from the FDA? Just watch Dope Sick on Netflix and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And finally, what sort of investment will it take to bring our healthcare technology, processes, and systems into the 21st century? Let's force our leaders to explain themselves and the way out of this mess. We wrote and covered this last week, but we wanted to remind you again because today's episode is all about the outrageous spending. And, let's just talk about it. Today we remember, and of course this is last week, the brave souls we lost in the horrible terrorist attack on September 11, 2001. Al-Qaeda terrorists led by Osama bin Laden carried out a desperate attack on New York City and the Pentagon, hijacking 4 planes and flying them kamikaze style into the towers of the World Trade Center and into the Pentagon. The 4th plane was famously brought down by patriotic passengers who got word from their loved ones and crashed that plane, rather than let it be used as another cursed arrow in the heart of the free people of America. Indeed, 9/11 stands out as a day in history like Pearl Harbor or the moon landing, in which everyone who was alive remembers where they were when it happened. We remember sharing hugs with strangers, crying and praying quietly together with hope and dread for the coming days and months and years and decades, as it turned out. We seldom reflect, in fact, on the other ways our society changed post 9/11. Before the attack, America had won the Cold War. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and Germany was reunified in 1991. That same year, 15 former Soviet states declared their independence, and the Soviet parliament in Russia voted to disband itself. America spent the 1990s in a huge post-war economic boom, fueled by Reagan tax cuts in the 80s and the internet revolution, which led to the first balanced budget. Hey, balanced budget. Wait a minute. You're saying the federal government can balance its budget? The It led to the first balanced budget in memory and the dot-com craze and subsequent bust of 2000. America was now the sole superpower in the world. Russia was unstable. China was still very much a third world country, having just been allowed to enter the World Trade Organization in 1998. The Middle East continued to see violence, but was generally stable, at least compared to now, I would posit. The Oslo Accords were signed with Bill Clinton in 1993, and there was some hope for a peace process that would lead to more stability. The Afghan Mujahideen had defeated the Soviet army in the 80s. Little did most know, it was also consolidating power, implementing Sharia law under a new authority, the Taliban. Then, despite many secret warnings, the singular event shocked America and changed the world. America was suddenly under attack, at war with a new power scarcely any Americans had even heard of. Al-Qaeda and other Islamic terrorist organizations just weren't in the zeitgeist here in America at that time. Commerce was completely halted as the nation came to grips with a new normal. Men with machine guns soon appeared at our airports. We started taking off our shoes and undergoing more rigorous screenings. The country was given a new color-coded warning system that seemed to systematize and compartmentalize our grief and our fear. Even if those measures had little practical effect, they inexplicably made us feel a little more safe, which was the intent. Our government next told us that we needed to go to war to stop Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and we were all in. All in. Patriotism thrived, America came together, and President Bush enjoyed the highest approval ratings on record as he galvanized the country for war. But the war wasn't fought by everyone. The volunteers that joined to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq came predominantly from the poor and lower middle class. Many of them gave their lives. Many more of them came home with wounds that never healed. Consumerism grew. Security concerns were paramount, with ever-increasing signs of protection, including those new gated and guarded communities with driveways dominated by warlike Hummers and Jeeps and Suburbans. It was all the new Fed. We invaded Afghanistan and subsequently Iraq. Our nation spent the next 20 years fighting endless regime change wars in the Middle East for what turned out to be little benefit. The war on terror cost Americans countless lives and $21 trillion, and we have precious little to show for it. While we were gallivanting across the Middle East, killing hundreds of thousands in a misguided attempt to build new, free, Western-style democracies in nations that had no idea what this was, they didn't know that they wanted it, and they sure didn't need it. China was prospering. We later found out that our military leaders believed for a long time what we just started to suspect within the last couple of years, that the war on terror had no goal. There was no exit strategy, and continued for decades. Just look up the Afghanistan papers, because our leaders were afraid to admit they had failed. We also traded our security for liberty at home. The Patriot Act enabled our government to spy on American citizens, to collect their private information without due process, and later to censor citizens' ideas the government did not like. Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald, when he was at The Intercept at the time, about 2014, they exposed a national spying program on Americans. People who represent the government, like James Clapper, lied about it. John Brennan lied about spying on Congress. These programs continue to this day. Despite their warnings from Snowden and Assange and others, these policies continue. We have sacrificed our liberties in a Faustian bargain for a deeply misplaced and alleged safety. Are we really safe because of it? Meanwhile, China, with a long-term plan and focused leadership, became the next superpower. They grow to be a permanent economic and military force. They have infiltrated our governments, our think tanks, our universities, and our homeland. Many countries which used to call the United States a friend are now economically, if not in fact, allies of China. It is a matter of time before China presses its advantage around the world with serious consequences for the peace and stability of the free world. 9/11 was a tremendous tragedy. Perhaps worse is the terrible strategy that America's leaders pursued in reaction. over the next 2 decades. We owe it to the brave souls who lost their lives on 9/11, to the amazing men and women of our armed forces who have battled, died, and lost in our behalf, and to each other, you and me. We owe it to ourselves to honestly assess and correct our reckless foreign and domestic policies born on 9/11. We must encourage real change in our foreign policy goals before the greatest nation that is predicated on the idea that government should be of the people, by the people, and for the people shall perish from this earth. And that is the view from the country today. We very much appreciate you watching and listening. We really hope that you can help support us at www.thecountry.news. Please go there and subscribe. And if you would, just make a small donation. We ask for $5 a month. And that is how we fund this show and how we can expand upon it and bring you even more content of higher quality and really help the country heal its wounds. So we really hope that you go there and you help us out. That's all we have today. See ya!
I want to win the lottery. I want to live like a Kennedy. I want to tell everyone how it should be. Country clubs and 100-foot yachts, sitting in all the premier spots and sipping on ancient scotch and afternoon tea. We can move to the country, stay out there for a year, spend a fortune on French wine and all the latest gear. I hear it catches up with you. Pretty soon they'll be begging you to support this and that and give it all away. But we'll stay in the country. Now eyes watch what we do. The end to carefreeness for fear of the news. Listen, can you hear him saying? Get me. Why don't you get me? Get me. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. Get me. So I'll change the national plan and give